think I can put the shutter back into this camera. Here's the shutter and lens assembly, of course, which I've previously serviced. So we'll just drop this back into the camera. Now this curved rack has to couple with this little pinion here. I just made sure that that curved rack is towards the top of the shutter. Make sure that the shutter release arm here drops down underneath this finger on the shutter release here. Put the shutter in place. Check that it's seated and try the film advance. So I'm holding the shutter in with my fingers like this. Press the release button, hold down the lock lever, swing the film advance gently, and I'm listening to see if I hear the shutter cocking action complete before the film advance stroke completes. And I don't think I did. No, the shutter's almost cocked, I can tell because the action's not blocked. But it's not quite. Well, that shutter release shaft's trying to get away, excuse me, while I make sure that that's sitting correctly. Just remove that for a second. It's a bit too much sideways tension on that. That's better, now that shaft's back where it should be. So back where we were, let's do that again. Oh, I did hear it cock that time. And the shutter fires, so that's good. That's correctly positioned. If it hadn't been correctly positioned, it would have meant that I would have needed to move the position of the curved rack relative to the shaft coming through the camera. And you do that by bringing the focus right out to the close focus position so that you can see the curved rack. Lift the shutter out of the camera just slightly, move the rack one direction or the other depending on whether you need the action to complete earlier or later in the film advance swing, and check to see what result you get. In an ideal world, the shutter should be cocked just prior to the end of the film advance lever stroke. If it cocks well before the end of the film advance lever stroke, you're in grave danger that the shutter will, the mechanism will reach its limit before the film advance reaches its limit, and you could end up damaging something. Well, I'm thinking of the cocking rack. So I'll just tighten that retaining ring up. Check what I've got. And I'm pressing the shutter release very slowly. I want to see if I have the adjustment correct. Now that just released the film advance, so I can tell because I heard the click. And if I hold my finger on the lock lever, I can swing the film advance again, even though the shutter hadn't been fired. So that tells me that the film advance had released too early, and it tells me that the screw is too high. So if I rotate that half a turn and try again. I'll just take that rubber band off because it makes this a bit awkward. I'm just pressing the shutter release very slowly. And the shutter released, but did the film advance release? Yes, it did. So that action must have happened pretty much simultaneously. I didn't hear a second click. So let me put the button on the top so I've got more control here. That definitely released the film advance before the shutter released. Let's tighten that screw up just a little bit more. Let's try a quarter of a turn. The film advance certainly released early there, so it's another quarter of a turn. Still doing it. Still doing it. No, that's good. So now I've got it at the point where the shutter is released and the film advance is released at pretty much the same point. And I'm happy with that. So that part's done. So we've got the lens and shutter assembly back in there. The shutter is adjusted. Rangefinder next, I suppose. Well, here's our rangefinder. Again, this has been already dealt with, stripped and cleaned in the earlier videos, and so it can go straight back onto the camera. Now I'm using some red lacquer there, which makes it easier for subsequent repairers to see what you've been up to. Making sure my focus scale is back at the infinity position. Put my rangefinder on, and the rangefinder arm here should be in front of that screw, in front of that boss. If you get it behind, it will not be good. We've got two screws, and they drop down from the top here. And in an ideal world, they drop straight down into the hole. And you can just tighten them up with your screwdriver. Now here, what I normally do is I hold this rangefinder body back towards the back of the camera, firmly against that post. That keeps it square with the body and in a solid registered position, if you like. Nip those two screws up. If I turn the focus scale, you'll see that the arm on the rangefinder moves with it. Now I'm going to peer out the window and see what the adjustment looks like, and it's not necessarily any good because we've moved everything. And I can see that the images do not meet at the infinity position on my focus scale ring. So it means a horizontal adjustment is needed. So loosen that screw, that's the lock screw, and I'm going to rotate this to swing this arm slightly forward. And a tiny bit is too much. And I'll peer back out the window. I've got a good infinity target opposite me. And now I've overdone it. It overshoots. It reached the images coincide before my focus scale ring reaches the infinity position. So I'll turn this screw back the other way just slightly. Did I mention that if you think you've moved it too far? That's what the adjustments are like. Okay, so the images converge in the finder at that point there, which is well before this reaches the infinity position. So to move that tiny adjustment again and see what I've got. No, a bit more. Where are we? No, still miles away. My video camera is telling me that the battery's tired. Oh, that must just about be it. I think that's it. I'm happy with that. So I'll lock the lock screw and check. Sometimes things move when you move the lock screw. It's just slightly off, I think. I think it must have shifted slightly. Now this time I made this tiny adjustment and locked the position in place. No, I'm still out. I think the lock screw is probably my enemy here. It's probably shifting things. Okay, that's good. I'm happy with that. We can move on to the next bit. Okay. I'll put a couple of drops of lacquer on here just to lock that screw on the top of the film advance. That's all that's required. There's no advantage in having a huge blob all the way across the top. Just take that little bit of excess off. Check that things are tight. They are. Here's the film release lever, release button. Run some molybdenum paste up through the shaft where that runs over the post. Put the spring in place. Put that in place. Here's our meter. You've got to get the end of this film release button, make sure that gets in underneath the meter here. It usually doesn't want to. Just checking that my meter seated correctly. My shutter release there is not positioned properly. That's better. Now there was a screw holding that down at the end. That plastic tab is pretty much disintegrated and gone away. We won't be trying to rescue that. But I'll put the screw in there, since that screw will act as a post, if you like, that the meter can push back against. It'll help locate that meter. Just run that down. That's good. Our shutter release button can go on. Is that shaft not seated correctly? It was not. Now it is. That dust on the top of the meter window, I want that off. That's better. Check rangefinder windows and so forth, make sure that they're all still clear. Hold my finger on the top of the meter, lower the cover over the top. Check that the film advance works and the shutter release is smooth. Now that shutter release is sticking in there. I think we decided on a previous occasion that it was slightly bent and it worked fine, rotated 180 degrees. So we will rotate that 180 degrees and see how it goes. The button back in place, put the top cover on, check the film advance, check the shutter release. That moves nice and smoothly. That's good. Peer through it, make sure there's no dust or obvious dirt in the viewfinder, that we have managed to put fingerprints on something. That's all looking good. Check my frame counter. See how that's counting. Now it seems to be moving more than one notch there at a time. Definitely is. That means that the position of the cocking rack is slightly different than what it was previously. It must have been one tooth over from where it's wanted. So I'm going to adjust that by winding in this screw so the frame counter doesn't move quite so far. Yeah, that's moving one frame at a time now, but it's just moving beyond, slightly beyond the number. So I'm just going to wind that screw in a little bit further. That's good, that's moving just nicely now. Okay. I think I can put the screws in the top cover. So we have two screws at the rewind end. If you look down and see that one of them's the wrong colour, it means that you've used your chrome screw up somewhere else. Make sure that top cover's seated all the way down. And we've got one screw here. Check that everything still moves smoothly. That the film release button goes up and down nicely. Frame counter looks good. I think we put the rewind knob back on. So push that up, push the shaft up from the inside so you can see it. Put the shroud on the top, spin the rewind knob on, drop it down, something through the fork to stop it turning. I'm just using the tail of my tweezers there, and that's good. Okay, the meter dial can go on next. Did I strip and clean this? No, I didn't. So we need to clean this, get rid of all that dirty old grease, get that all nice and clean and put it back on the camera. So a little bit of naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid is what's wanted. Okay, there's all the bits and pieces. Now note that there are two holes in here, two small holes, and they couple to those two protrusions on the top. I rotate that all the way around clockwise. This wavy washer, I'll put a smear of synthetic grease on that. And it doesn't need much. Pop that in there. Here is our film speed dial that can go on the top. Here is a small plane washer that can go on the top. Sometimes that'll be present, sometimes it's not. This piece with the indicator on it, that can go on. Small wavy washer, let's give that a wipe with a bit of synthetic grease. That drops in the centre. Then we have the screw. I'll run that down. I haven't tightened it up yet. I want to check where my mark is, and it's here. We started off, it was halfway between the 17 and the 18. I think that was actually incorrect, and when I check this against my other meter, it should be somewhere further around there, close to the 16. So I've got, at the moment, that mark is between 16 and 17. I'm going to tighten this screw up, because I think I'm probably going to move that dial slightly clockwise, which is okay. That'll tighten the screw up rather than loosening it. And I'm going to check this against my meter and see how it reads, and if that's accurate, all well and good. If I need to make an adjustment, I'll make an adjustment, and I'll report back on the accuracy of that meter, or the apparent accuracy of that meter. Well, I checked that and it was just slightly off, and it was as I expected. In this case, my alignment mark here should have been against the 16, not the between the 17 and the 18, so that's about a stop and a half out. It meant that the meter was out by about a stop and a half to start off with. Otherwise, the meter appears to be quite good, and when I say it's quite good, I mean that it, when set to read correctly at one light level, it also reads correctly at other light levels. When the selenium cell is failing, you often find that if you set it correctly at one light level, at a different light level, it'll read incorrectly. It'll read high, or it might read low, which of course is useless. you need one that'll read accurately regardless, at least over a reasonable range of daylight lighting conditions. Right, leatherette on the base now I think, because we need to close this up. Right, I'll need all this dirt and rubbish off the base of the leatherette. Those green marks, that was the ice bumps we could see forming on the leatherette to start with. And this leatherette's got a bit of a greasy feel to it. I'll certainly need to wipe that down with some naphtha. I'll do that now. Be careful about what you choose to wipe leatherettes down with, because solvents will damage them quite effectively. Here I'm just wanting to lift any dust and oils off the surface so that the adhesive will stick well. We've got this little hole at the edge where the hinge pin screw had come through previously. I'm going to cut a little triangular patch into that, so I'll just cut that back. Now we've got a great big hole. That's fine, we can deal with that. Want some adhesive on here, and I'll need a bit of leatherette for patching purposes. I'll just cut this notch out a bit tidier, I think. That looks a bit better. That's very close to 90 degrees. And here's a scrap I found, which I think will do fine. Let's cut a piece of this. Check and see what sort of a fit we get. Get that angle right. It's not bad, I need to square that up a little bit. Like that. Oh yes, I'm happy with that. I'll put a bit of masking tape behind that to hold it, and then cut it from the front. Looks good. Now I can trim that patch. And you can see those two pieces together, that's filled in nicely. You can ignore the grey look of that, that's just because it's dusty and dirty. That'll come right. Right, so prepare the camera to put the leatherette on the base, I suppose. Let's have the film advance lever off. Once over the base with some naphtha to make sure that there's no oil or grease on the metalwork. That's good. Right. Bring our leatherette back into the picture. Now apply some adhesive. With small pieces of leatherette, you would apply the adhesive to a piece of paper beside you and then transfer it over on a cotton bud, on a toothpick. Because this is a larger piece, I can put it on here directly. I don't want to get it on the top surface if I can help it. Sometimes the leatherette is more sensitive to solvent than at other times. Possibly because they use different materials at the time, or possibly that the adhesive I use isn't always exactly the same from one batch to the other. Pretty much it, a little bit more and we'll be done. That should be fine. Peel that off there. Bring back in the camera body. And get that leatherette in position. Little threads of the cotton backing that are sticking out can be snipped off. That looks fine. Now, where's our little patch? Get some adhesive. Find our little patch. Give that a generous coat. Pop that into position. There you have it. Now the leatherette had a bubble in it here, a Zeiss bump. I'm just pressing that down so that it sits a bit flatter than it once did. Checking that it's free everywhere else, that it's looking good. Rub away any excess adhesive. It's snuck out around the corners. Check that that patch is pushed in tight against the leatherette. That looks good. Put the advance lever back in place. I'm not picking up those holes. That's better. And where's our little patch for the middle of the advance lever? Here it is. Bit over generous there, I think. Make sure you get it right to the edges. And the Leatherette does have a bit of a grain to it. You can match up the grain of this. And what's that leave us? Oh, just the back catch cover and so forth. Right, the back catch cover. Let's get this together. I'm sure I've shown this video a million times. The screw through there. Hook the spring into position. And holding this as an assembly. Lower it carefully into place. Run that screw down very carefully. Check that this moves freely. Tighten that screw up. Check it still moves freely. Put the other screw in. And that, I think, is that. So here we have our 3C. This is the later type of 3C, the one that had the single range meter, much like that used on the 3 big C cameras. And this one is now ready for a new home, I think. So, how do we select a new home?